Hey, let's talk about evolution. Let's talk about changing distributions. And most of all, let's talk about why variation matters. It's me, Moser. After this video, you should be able to compare distributions and identify the conditions under which changes in distributions would be most likely to occur, and compare the effects of changing conditions on populations that have different levels of genetic diversity. You should already know your basic distributions, and you should know a little bit about what variation means. You already know that one of the most common definitions for evolution is changes in the distribution of a trait or the frequency of an allele in a population over generations. And you know that all populations, that's a group of individuals of the same species, like these crappie or these ducks, living in one geographical area, or these ladybugs, that are able to interbreed. All populations have got natural variation, differences between the individuals of a species. And variation can occur in pretty much any heritable trait, like height or the length of legs, fur color, ear color, producing a particular enzyme that somebody might need to digest lactose. Yep, good old variation. And for most traits, if we graph the distribution of the trait in a population, we find something that looks like this. It's a normal distribution. Many individuals will have some version of the trait that's near the middle of the range, close to the average of the possibilities. And a very few individuals will be found out at the extreme ends. When conditions in the environment mean that having a variation of the trait that isn't average, either above or below average, gives an individual some kind of advantage, we tend to see the distribution shift towards the variation of the trait that gives an advantage. Well, let's think about your friendly neighborhood wild rabbit. Aww. It's the eastern cottontail, also known as Sylvadegus floridensis. You know these guys, little herbivores, brown fur, fluffy white tail, long ears. Each of those traits is an adaptation, evolved over millions of generations to enable cottontails to survive in their range. Their range being eastern North America, as far north as Canada, and as far south as Mexico and Central America. This species has had to survive blazingly hot summers, freezing cold winters, not to mention the fact that every predator out there would love a tasty rabbit meal. You can imagine the advantage each of these features gives them. The fur, which grows in thick in the winter, keeps them warm. That mottled brown color provides great camouflage. And those lovely ears, they're on a swivel. And they swivel all around, allowing them to hear predators. Did you know those lovely ears also serve another purpose? Well, what could it be? Have you ever overheated on a summer day? You sure wouldn't want to be wearing a winter coat on a summer day, would you? That'd make it hard to cool off. Though cottontails do shed their winter coat in favor of a thinner summer coat, the fact is, they're still wearing fur. Have you ever noticed that their ears don't have fur? Those ears have also got some very prominent blood vessels in them. Those ears act as radiators. They help rabbits cool down by channeling blood through a very thin, flat surface. Is there some amount of natural variation in rabbit ears? Woohoo, you bet! Could we create a distribution showing the length of rabbit ears? Of course! Does ear length make a difference? Yes! Larger ears, like these beauties, allow rabbits to shed heat more efficiently, while smaller ears like these little cuties, would mean that a rabbit would lose less body heat through their ears. If we were to have a series of extremely cold winters and cooler than usual summers, which of those rabbits would have an advantage? The rabbits with the smaller ears. What would we expect to see change in that distribution that we saw earlier? We would probably see the distribution shift down to the lower end. And what if we see a climate that warms overall, warmer winters and hotter summers? Which rabbits have an advantage under those conditions? The rabbits with the longer ears. What would we expect to see change in the distribution that we saw earlier? We would expect to see that distribution shift to the higher end. Very often, as a population is going through a shift in the distribution, that distribution is skewed towards one end or the other. But eventually, we regain a normal distribution, with the mode, the high point of the distribution, being at a higher or lower value than it was. That change in distribution is evolution. And after a number of generations of that kind of shifting, we might see a species that looks significantly different than its ancestor species. For some traits, such as what color flowers a plant produces, or whether or not someone produces an enzyme that lets them digest milk, graphing distribution isn't nearly as useful. And in those cases, we might want to look at gene or allele frequency instead. Remember that alleles are versions of a gene, and for simple dominant recessive traits, shown with a capital letter and a lowercase letter. In pea plants, purple flowers are dominant to white flowers. In humans, the ability to digest dairy products as an adult is dominant to not being able to, or being lactose intolerant. When working with traits like this, we graph the percentage of the population that carries a version of the gene in question, called allele frequency. When we see changes in the frequency of one version of a gene in a population, we would say that that population has evolved. We assume that if having one version of a gene, an allele, gives individuals some sort of advantage, over time, the percentage of the population that carries that version of a gene will increase. If having one version of the gene gives individuals a disadvantage, the percentage of the population that carries that version of the gene will decrease over time. The change in allele frequency over generations, well, that's evolution. Well, so what? Does it matter? Does it matter that 50% of a population carries a gene for dark fur? I mean, does that matter? Does it matter that 35% of a population carries an allele that protects them against malaria? Or that 62% of a population has a variation of a gene that allows them to more effectively fight off the HIV virus? Well, it does if conditions change, and only those with one particular version of the allele are able to survive. Having a population with high genetic diversity, that is, a good mixture of genes, makes the population, well, or at least some of its members, more likely to survive when climate conditions change or disease sweeps through, or when something disrupts their habitat. In populations with high levels of genetic diversity, we see nice wide normal distributions for a whole lot of traits. We also see widely varying allele frequency. Not everyone is carrying the same genes. Not everyone has the same versions of a trait. We see a population that's adaptable. So now let's talk about a species with low levels of genetic diversity. Cheetahs are beautiful and sleek and fast. cheetahs across the globe are also all so closely related, they're able to undergo skin grafts from any other cheetah on the planet and not reject the donor tissue. Let that sink in for a second. They're that genetically similar. Well, that's because about 10,000 years ago, cheetahs went through a genetic bottleneck, an event where very few cheetahs survived. And all modern cheetahs are descendants of those few. This means they have very low genetic diversity. In essence, a species with low genetic diversity may also have low levels of variation in important traits. We see narrow distributions. Allele frequencies for multiple traits will show that almost all or almost no individuals have a particular allele. This is dangerous for the survival of the population. You never know what trait or variation of a trait will be important, because there's no predicting what challenges the environment will throw at a species. Variation, a mixture of genes, is essential to keeping a species strong and healthy. Species with low levels of this kind of variation just can't evolve to meet challenges that their environment presents them with. Those species with low levels of diversity face dwindling populations, and they often face extinction. Okay, let's just check in. Do you feel like you can compare distributions and identify the conditions under which there would be changes in a distribution? Can you compare the effects of changing conditions on populations that have different levels of genetic diversity? Do you understand why variation is important? Good. Keep moving.